Facebook has blocked President Trump on its platforms for at least 2 weeks and possibly indefinitely. This means that the president and potentially some others will not be able to post on Facebook or Instagram until after the transition of power to President-elect Joe Biden. Facebook CEO Mark Zuckerberg wrote that the risks of allowing Mr. Trump to post are simply too great. He says the social network decided to remove his statements from the platform on Wednesday because they believed the intent of the message would provoke even more violence. For more on this, I want to bring in Cambridge Analytica whistleblower Christopher Wylie. He exposed the company's role in President Trump's 2016 presidential campaign, and he uncovered the company's misuse of data from the Facebook accounts of millions of people. Thank you for joining us now. Let's start off. Facebook actually banned you from all of its platforms back in 2018 after you exposed an international scheme that used the social media giant as a political tool to target voters with manipulative misinformation. What do you make of the company's decision to now block President Trump, and how is it different from the actions that Facebook took against you?
Well, when Facebook found out that I was working with The Guardian, New York Times, and also with both federal investigators and also European investigators into the longstanding misuse of data on their platform and the widespread use of disinformation, their first response was to ban me from the platform for my whistleblowing, and then to threaten journalists at The Guardian with, lawsuits. And the thing that I find interesting about that is that, it only took them 24 hours to ban me over providing information to law enforcement agencies. And it took them 4 years to ban a president who has been consistently inciting hatred and violence, for the entire duration of his presidency. And I think what that shows is that, there's an underlying, gap of morality within the company, or at least at the top in the leadership of the company, because they don't really care about what's happening on their platform. They care about whether or not, their relationships with people in power are politically expedient. Now that Donald Trump is no longer, or at least in 2 weeks' time will no longer be president, he's no longer politically expedient, and they toss him for that reason.
So, Christopher, do you think that if he had been reelected, or if we were facing this whole situation because of the midterm elections, and he still had several more years to his presidency, that the social media, these social media giants wouldn't have acted?
I don't believe that they would have. Honestly, you look at the history of Facebook and its inaction on countless. We have to remember that what's happened in the United States with riots is not new in the context of Facebook globally. When you look at what's happened in, for example, Myanmar, where Facebook played a contributing factor to the ethnic cleansing that happened in that country, or the riots that happened in Sri Lanka, or unrest in Brazil, this is not a new thing for Facebook. And so, although it's new in the sense of, since the War of 1812, there hasn't been a storm on Congress, there's the consistent pattern that, of consequences of Facebook's inaction when it comes to tackling disinformation and incitement of hatred. And it does not act until it is absolutely forced to. In the case of Cambridge Analytica and my whistleblowing, that was a case that Facebook knew about for years, and it did nothing, about it. It was only until I went and talked to The Guardian, New York Times, and law enforcement that they actually, bothered to show up at Congress and testify, and at least pay lip service to the fact that they have, an underlying, civil duty to the democracy that allows it to be a business.
Christopher, I want to read part of your testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee in May of 2018. You said, quote, Facebook knew about Cambridge Analytica's scheme since 2015. Cambridge Analytica sought to identify mental vulnerabilities in voters and sought to exploit them by targeting information meant to activate some of the worst characteristics in people, such as neuroticism, paranoia, and racial biases. I'm wondering if you think that given that social media benefits in the algorithms from continuing to sow discord, if there's any way that we can put this genie back in the bottle, or is it just too late?
Of course we can. One of the sort of bizarre things about the situation that we're in is, when we talk about the tech sector, and whether or not we can regulate it, for example, airplanes have regulation, nuclear power plants have regulation, all kinds of technical sectors have regulation. And for whatever reason, when we talk about digital platforms, we sort of ignore the sort of regulatory norms that we've applied to every other industry. And there's a really important principle in regulation of technical sectors, which is the harm prevention principle. When you are designing a new airplane, when you're designing a new cancer drug or a vaccine, or any kind of highly technical thing that will go and be released into the consumer market, it is normal to require companies to do preliminary safety testing to understand the behavior of the device or technology that they're creating, whether it's an airplane or a drug, prior to release into the public. And the biggest difference that we have with Facebook and social media companies and other technical sectors is that they are not required to do due diligence on their own platform. So absolutely, yes, we can fix this problem, but we need to create a regulatory environment which requires them to act. Otherwise, they won't.
It's a very different approach that you're describing, Christopher. I know a lot of times when people are talking about the difficulty in regulations for these social media platforms, it has revolved around the inability to really stop people from posting or to hold people accountable for other people espousing racist beliefs or harmful beliefs. But thinking about the product that they're creating and how they're creating it, the algorithms that sow this discord, that is part of a safety testing mechanism, is a very interesting approach. And I actually want to play for our viewers something that you told our technology reporter, Dan Patterson, about how social media create divisiveness. Let's take a listen to that.
A word that often is used by social media companies, they often call themselves communities. But the problem with that is that if you create many gated communities, you don't actually have a coherent community. You have a segregated community.
So one of the things that we're seeing, Christopher, is actually that that some of these segregated communities have been moving off of these major platforms like Facebook or Instagram or Twitter, and are now going to more of these alt-right conspiracy theory espousing platforms that where they can meet even more like-minded people and keep more people who might challenge those conspiracy theories out. I'm wondering if you have a solution that lawmakers need to be employing when it comes to the emergence of these new conspiracy-driven social platforms.
Yeah, I think so. One of the problems that I find when I talk with legislators, politicians, regulators is the language that we use. So often these platforms are framed as services. They're free services, quote unquote, that people can use. And the real issue with that is that, when you look at how, who is actually inside of these companies, and you look at their job titles, it's not service relationship manager, it's architect and it's engineer. And when we think about the problem of segregation in physical spaces, the real issue with, having people, whether through legal enforcement, in times past or through, cultural and self-motivated segregation, the real problem is that we create different experiences of which inhibit us from connecting to one another. And in the physical world, we do not allow architects to create communities that are designed to separate people. That would be unlawful. And in the same sense, whether it's in financial services or other kinds of sectors, you cannot separate people. That cannot be a business model. And it also cannot be a design, an underlying design. When you look at how a lot of these platforms work, the algorithms that are created are intended to separate and parse out different groups into different clusters of people. And in marketing or in tech, you'll call that segmentation, but there's another word for it, which is segregation. And if we're designing our entire information ecosystem on the premise that we should be separating people, we have a lot of the same kinds of effects of segregation that we've seen in the past, except it's now just germinating online. And so I think when we're looking at online spaces, we really need to port over the learning that we've had from history about what to do about common spaces and public commons and who gets to be together, and desegregate these platforms. Desegregation needs to be a principle that isn't just enshrined in law when it comes to designing neighborhoods in suburbs. It needs to be a principle enshrined in law when it comes to these digital spaces as well.
Very interesting stuff. Christopher Wylie, thank you.
Cheers.